As a wise man once said,
Breaking up is hard to do.
anyone who's been part of a failed relationship can attest to the stress and angst a split can cause for everyone involved. This applies to individuals as well as nations. In fact, the breakup of one-time allies can have consequences that will reverberate across the decades, which makes this alternate historian wonder, what if one of these infamous splits never happened? Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitchridge, the alternate historian. In this video, we're looking at a timeline where the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China remained allies. But first, the historical context. To some people, the Cold War was a global struggle between two different ideological camps, the capitalists, led by the United States of America, and the communists, led by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. As is usually the case, things were actually more complicated than posterity remembers. Both sides had their own divisions, some more consequential than others, but by far the most significant in terms of how the Cold War played out was the relationship between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Following the end of World War II in 1945 and the victory of the Communists in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the Soviet Union and China formally became allies in 1950 with the signing of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. And while China was the junior partner in this alliance, they were not a Soviet client state like much of Eastern Europe. They could ignore Moscow and even practice their own form of communism, Maoism, named after the PRC's founder and dictator, Mao Zedong. Nevertheless, relations between the two nations remained cordial, as the USSR gained exclusive access to Chinese markets, and in turn, China got various types of aid from the Soviets. Mao was also cool with recognizing the USSR's premier, Joseph Stalin, as a leader of the communist world. But things started to go downhill following Stalin's death in 1953. Mao did not like Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev's, denouncement of Stalin or his refusal to confront America more directly, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, treating both as a betrayal of the communist movement. For their part, the Soviets did not approve of Chinese programs like the Great Leap Forward of 1958 to 1962, which was an economic program to transform China's agrarian economy into an industrialized one, but instead led to one of the world's largest famines, which Mao blamed on Soviet policies toward China. Additionally, Khrushchev worried that China's antagonistic foreign policy and nuclear weapons program would make it harder for him to reach any kind of détente with America, who feared China getting the bomb so much that Presidents Kennedy and Johnson both considered ways to sabotage it. Unable to resolve these and other disputes, the Soviets and Chinese broke off relations with each other in 1961, and the communist world was split. Mao went on to purge China of anyone even remotely pro-Soviet during the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976. By 1969, the situation deteriorated to an actual shooting war on the Soviet-Chinese border along the Amur River. I have to emphasize how big of a deal this was. This would be the equivalent of, let's say, the United States breaking off relations with UK and France during the Cold War and then getting involved in a shooting war along the St. Lawrence River. Meanwhile, America, having spent a good chunk of the 1960s assuming the dispute was all an elaborate ruse to trick them, belatedly took advantage of the situation by improving relations with China. This ultimately led to American President Richard Nixon visiting China in 1972, which in turn opened up China to the rest of the capitalist world. This, along with other reforms I'll discuss later, helped propel China to being a great power in its own right, while in turn the Soviet Union stagnated and eventually collapsed. But what if this split didn't happen? What if China and the Soviet Union remained allies? Now, how to create such a timeline is a tough question, but there are a couple options. Professor and author Robert Farley, who published several articles in the national interest that I found extremely useful for this video, and I will link to below, blames Mao for the split and suggests that had he died in 1949, shortly after the proclamation of the People's Republic, some other Chinese communist leader like, and I'm sorry if I butchered their names, Liu Shaoqi or Zhao Enlai would have taken over. Unlike Mao, they would not have been able to establish a cult of personality or prevent infighting between the various factions of the PRC. Thus, this alternate China might feel the need to stay close to the USSR. Additionally, no Mao likely means no Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, and thus forestall a lot of human suffering. Alternatively, we could get someone besides Khrushchev to lead the Soviets after Stalin. Someone who Mao approves of and would directly challenge America more. Although we need to be careful, otherwise we could turn this into a what if the Cuban Missile Crisis goes hot video. But let's say someone besides Mao is in charge of the People's Republic of China during the Cold War. What happens next? Well, for one thing, better relations between the USSR and China would mean a more favorable economic forecast for the Soviets, as China would continue to be a major economic partner. In fact, this could be helpful during the 1980s oil glut, which followed the energy crisis of the 1970s. You see, during that crisis, the Soviet Union became a major producer of oil. But due to stalled economies across the world and energy conservation measures taken, the demand for oil dwindled, which hurt the Soviet economy and perhaps contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. But in this alternate timeline, continuing to trade with China means the Soviets would have a major customer for their oil, and this could help their economy weather the economic hardships of the 1980s. And it should go without saying that the Sino-Soviet border conflict of 1969 probably wouldn't happen. In fact, a more unified communist bloc may prevent other splits, like the Soviet-Albanian split, or it could lead to more organized support of anti-colonial Marxist groups in the global south, or it could avoid conflicts between China and Southeast Asian communist nations. For example, Chinese support for North Vietnam would likely continue. On our timeline, China withdrew support after they refused to take China's side in the split with the Soviets, and thus they started providing aid to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So in this alternate timeline, North Vietnam has supported the entire communist world during the Vietnam War, while in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge may never come to power, as they received almost all of their aid from China, thus possibly preventing the genocide that happened there. Nevertheless, that also could mean the American intervention in South Vietnam could go on longer and be far bloodier. Speaking of America, presumably they'd be more anti-communist in this timeline when facing an actual unified communist bloc, rather than the imagined one in their heads. So you wouldn't see Nixon going to China, and if 1984's Red Dawn still gets made, there will likely be more Asian actors appearing as part of the communist invaders of America. Of course, this means China would be cut off from the capitalist world for much longer, which means Chinese economic successes from our timeline could be delayed. But I should point out that détente with America was only part of the reason for the growth of China's economy during the late 20th century. Agricultural reforms and encouraging foreign investment into their special economic zones, first created in 1979, also helped and might still happen in this alternate timeline. In our timeline, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev did try to imitate these reforms throughout the 1980s. Perhaps if relations between the Soviets and Chinese were more cordial, which in turn would prop up the Soviet economy like I previously mentioned, the Soviet Union might have had more success in adopting these reforms and could prevent the fall of the USSR. This in turn would prevent the anti-communist revolutions of 1989, which means most of Eastern Europe could still be communist and under control of the Soviet Union. Indeed, with a more united and successful communist bloc, the United States might feel the need to put up a more effective deterrent in the Pacific. So in this alternate timeline, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, could be taken more seriously. In our timeline, this military alliance between Southeast Asia and Pacific nations was formed in 1954 to combat communist expansion in the region. It was, however, pretty ineffective, wasn't taken all that seriously by America, and it lacked much of the structure of its NATO counterpart. It was dissolved in 1977 after several member states had already left. However, in this alternate timeline, the US might put more of an effort into making SEATO into a real military alliance. Or they might just let Japan have nukes. As Robert Farley pointed out, despite being the only victim of a nuclear attack, Japan did consider building their own nuclear weapons in the 1960s, but the United States in our timeline pressured Japan to drop it. However, in a timeline where the Sino-Soviet split didn't happen, America might see Japan having nukes as an effective deterrent against a nuclear-armed China. This in turn could also mean a more militaristic Japan, which leads to even greater tensions in East Asia, even among American allies. Fears of Japan becoming expansionist again could lead to South Korea and Taiwan developing their own nuclear weapons. Additionally, any reservations China might have about staying allied to the USSR may evaporate in the face of this nuclear proliferation across East Asia. That's the second time a nuclear flashpoint came up in this video. Did the Sino-Soviet split actually help prevent World War III? That's good, I guess. As I said before, breaking up is hard to do. But looking at the Sino-Soviet split, it certainly seems like it was good for China, and perhaps the world in general. A united communist bloc would mostly only benefit the Soviet Union, lead to the spread of nuclear weapons, and increase the risk of nuclear war. Granted, it's hard to know with any certainty what the long-term effects will be when you change history, so if you have any ideas about what the timeline would look like if the Sino-Soviet split didn't happen, let me know in the comments. Well, that's all to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.